I see it.
Okay. So one thing to keep in mind is that this feature is not GA yet, and accordingly, it's only available in select regions. They're documented they're in the docs if you go read about resource providers and custom resources. And it does work in Service Catalog today quite well. It is possible to do what we're about to do in Azure Managed Applications published through Partner Center, but it requires a pretty deep integration with Swagger and documentation of the Azure APIs. So I'm not going to say too much more about that other than to note that right now, this is a fairly complex thing to try and pull off, although we are working to simplify this process so that we can take what we do in Service Catalog and make it just as easy to do that in Azure Managed Applications. So with that, let's take a look at what custom resources are. They are, there we go. In effect, a way to declare a resource of your own, a resource type of your own. Let's say you're a database vendor and you deploy a database into your customer's managed resource group, and you would like to programmatically address it, say with a function or something that is going to write into that database, for example. A way to reference it will be to form a relationship between that resource and the Azure APIs such that it is considered an Azure resource. That's kind of what we're doing here. Well, it turns out that Azure resource providers are nothing new. We have them today. We use them all the time. In fact, we've been looking at them all day. And the way this breaks down is at the top, we have the entry points into Azure, PowerShell, Azure CLI, Azure Portal, all these entry points into which we can, through which we can work on resources in Azure. Typically, we use Azure Resource Manager to do that when we're talking about larger deployments. Now, as part of Azure Resource Management, as part of ARM templates, we've been seeing resource provider types. So Microsoft, I believe it was data storage, right? That's one. And each type of service or resource that we deploy into Azure has a defined resource type and provider. So that provider is what allows you to create that resource. So what we want to do is not just deploy into our subscription and then our resource group. We want to do that into our managed resource group and have access to those resources. Over here on the left, you'll see that we have, we don't need to paste that URL in, but what I want you to note about this is that we've got Microsoft custom providers as our provider type. And that's new, right? As opposed to Microsoft storage, data storage, for example. So we also have a parameterized part of this address, this identity of the resource that will be something that we give it. So we're able to identify this resource as via this resource ID from Azure. All right, let's take a look at how this is going to work. So we're going to deploy from ARM into our managed resource group, a custom resource provider that now lives in the managed resource group. In the previous slide, what I didn't quite note is that the Azure resource providers, those things that create the resources that we have in Azure, like say Cosmos DB, those things live at the Azure API level, right? And pretty much Azure CLI, PowerShell, Portal, all that stuff is wrappers around the direct API. And those things live there in Azure itself. Well, in this model, those Azure custom resource providers are going to live within the managed resource group so that they have a contained boundary to the application scope. All right. This is a really big fancy graphic that talks a little bit about how we're able to create these custom resources, rather. So as we talked about a little bit, using any sort of ARM technology, we're able to create all this stuff, right? We're able to release policy. We're able to set RBAC on accounts and things like that. We can do whatever we want with ARM in that control plane, right? And the APIs that are sitting here have those CRUD operations available on these things. But what if we wanted to create something other than that? Well, we can, in our managed applications, create something called a custom resource provider, as we said, that lives at the managed application scope. And so this is a deceptively simple but big deal. That text there that I just put a red box around. Partners extend the Azure control plane to new services for customers. So quite literally, we're about to add endpoints to Azure, if you will. All right. And today, of course, Azure resource providers, we have over 200 Azure services, each one of which has a provider associated with it that is the mechanism for creating that service or resource. Here we're going to create a different one. So let's start with how, we've looked at this a little bit earlier, but I want to be clear about how this is going to work before we get started. So in service catalog deployments, you've done this. So you packaged your zip file up and put it in a storage account. Good stuff. And then you created a service catalog definition. And from that, you deployed and created an Azure Managed Application. Good enough. We're going to do that now. Only this time, we're going to use custom resource providers in our solution. All right. So we're going to start with view definition. And view definition, as you'll recall, I'm sure, is actually, let's not. Let's start with our main template. Yeah, on the fly. Let's just make that change. David, so, yeah.
Quick question. Can I use a private link and a private service inside my managed app offer?
Can I use a private link inside my... I'm not quite sure I understand the question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, my guess is, can I use private links for custom providers, I guess?
Well, I think we're going to see here in just a minute what's going on.
Oh, so I can answer this one quickly, though. It's for private links. You can use them. The one thing you have to watch out for is that your policy within the Azure subscription allows those services to be added to the various network security groups. So it's possible that you use private links, but because of the way things are locked down, your managed app isn't allowed to set those things up anyhow. So just be warned that if things are locked down in policy, you may have to do some stuff by hand and have your customers rerun your managed app installation.
Thank you, Scott.
Yep. I ran into this with one of our partners last week, so that's the only reason I know.
You're fresh there. Okay, awesome. Go ahead, David.
Scott, before you walk off of that, for those who may not know, can you define private link in this context?
Yeah, so private link is what we use. It's for example, whenever you're setting up a storage account, one of the things in the storage account setup is there's a networking tab in there, and the networking tab allows you to say whether or not the storage account can only be accessed from services connected to a given network. That technology is called private link. It just makes sure that the service isn't accessible to the world. It's only accessible to the set of services on a given network.
Hey, thanks, man. Appreciate that.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you, Cook.
All right, so we're looking at a plain Jane ARM template that's not doing anything very complex here. What we are doing is deploying an application service that is going to hold a function app. And here is that function app that we're going to deploy. And note that it depends on a storage account being created along with that server farm resource we just saw above. So it's looking for the storage account that's defined here. So in this ARM template, we have 3 resources that are being created. One's a function, one is the platform for hosting that function, and one is the storage account. What we're going to do is add a 4th resource type, which there's a lot of stuff associated with it here. So I'm going to do what I do and pull that down so we can go through it a little bit at a time. All right. It depends on those websites being created, on that website being created. And what's interesting about it is that, let's take a look here in particular. Actually, let me do this. This type here is what's interesting for us. Microsoft custom provider / resource providers. What we're effectively doing here is we're declaring a custom resource provider. And if we look under variables, we're giving it the name public. Okay, so that's the resource provider name. So far, not terrifically interesting, but what are we doing? Well, it turns out that, let's look at resource types first. Since this is a resource provider, we get to define the resource types that get created. And in this case, we're going to be dealing with users and motorcycles, because I ride motorcycles and thought that would be fun. So we're going to create 2 different custom resource types, and we do that through this custom provider. Again, we're declaring all of this in ARM, right? And the next thing we're going to look at are actions. So these are things that we can do both with the custom resource providers or custom resources and some other menu items that we'll see on our managed application. What's going on here is that we're pointing, note this, we're pointing with this long string and URL to the function that we're deploying. So we're deploying this function. We've defined, and you can see it down here too, that users are managed via this function, this endpoint that we happen to be deploying, and the resource type is users. And we can use this endpoint for CRUD operations against user resources. Also, we can define custom actions. Again, these are things that we can define anything we want to have happen on that endpoint and invoke that operation. Doesn't have to be the same endpoint that we're using for resource types. It just happens to be in this example because we're only deploying one function. Okay. Now, let's jump over to view definition. So view definition so far is looking pretty standard, just like we've seen in the past, but remember we added some actions to our ARM template. We can take advantage of them, here in a couple of different ways. One of which is with a command. And a command is going to declare a menu item that lives in the overview. We'll take a look at this in just a second. And it's going to be called this ping action. And what'll happen is it basically reaches out and makes sure that we've got to keep alive on our service. All right. So the next thing I'll look at with you, let me get hold of things. You don't have to watch me type. That's the worst thing I could do to you. Note that this is going to be a completely separate view. We have views here, and we'll add one here. And this view is what defines our custom resources. So again, I'm just gonna focus on one thing at a time here. So remember earlier, we had three types of resources, three kinds of resources that we could define. Oh, went away. I lost my IntelliSense. That's funny. One of them is custom resources. We had metrics, which we saw, and now custom resources. So what do we want to be the display name for our button that allows us to have access to our motorcycles? Well, how about motorcycles? What is the resource type that we're going to be managing behind that button? Well, it turns out it's motorcycles, which is exactly what we defined over in main template. Now we've got something kind of weird. We've got create UI definition, which is a file, right? Well, it's a layout technology. And so what we're doing in this file in view definition is saying that we're going to use the effectively the schema of create UI definition to declare the layout for how we want to view and experience our custom resources. And so when we lay that out, notice that it actually has steps associated with it, just like we did in our create UI def earlier, and it has elements. Those elements map to the map to a text box here, and we name that text box. And then the outputs of that create UI definition here, we're grabbing it right here, manufacturer and model. So that's what we're going to have as that constitute a motorcycle. What constitutes a motorcycle? A manufacturer and a model. Now, how do we actually work with these things? We have a custom context action. Remember, we said that we were creating that in our ARM template a few moments ago. We're taking advantage of that for motorcycles. And remember, we also said that when I click what will ultimately be this button, then I can perform any action I want by making that API call. And just a little factoid, we can put different types of icons in here should we choose. I have the schema declared properly. All right. And lastly, when looking at our custom resources and their layout, we can define the different columns that we want to see as we list our custom resources. And in this case, we want to see manufacturer and model, of course, and we're tying back to those properties that we saw earlier where we defined manufacturer and model. So before we go any further, is this holding up for folks? Anybody have any thoughts or questions so far? I'm just going to check chat here.
Hi, there's a question about how to preview it on the UI.
Wouldn't it be great if we had a sandbox? The answer is that's what service definitions are for, right? That's our stomping ground for playing around with Azure Managed Apps before we actually deploy them into Partner Center. So that's where we have to work with these things. And unfortunately, we don't have a sandbox for view definitions at this time.
Right, they have to use the service catalog.
Right. So we go in, we zip this stuff up, and we deploy it. Let's not have you have to watch that and look at what we have. Well, first of all, here's the Azure Managed Application that was deployed via those demo files just a moment ago. So this is a demo. We customized our overview, as you may recall. And now we've got a couple of things that we can look at, one of which is this button, ping action. Remember, we defined that. What do we say that was? It was a keep alive, right? And what we can do is hit that, Notice that it's actually running a command in Azure. This is a first-class citizen of Azure. Look at that. It completed an operation against an Azure API, or at least what it considers an Azure API, which is the endpoint that we defined. And I'm going to go into the managed resource group now. And it's this function that's being invoked. Okay, so it's the one doing all the magic for us. And speaking of all the magic, we're going to come back and look at the internals of that function in just a moment. Before we do, let's have a look at what is happening. We defined, or in the example that I deployed here, I defined two resource types. I defined a user and a motorcycle. Let's see, Alexander notes, no sandbox environment for UI preview. Hey man, I completely agree. There's nothing more that I would enjoy rather than having one of those. And I don't know what to say other than that. I know that the product team is aware of this need. So we have two resource types here that have been defined, users and motorcycles. Let's go into users. And it turns out that I don't have any users defined yet in this application, so I'll define one. And I'll put our buddy Julio in there. Oops, let me go back and fix him. There we go. And we're able to, check this out, review and create. So what does that tell you? This is, again, a first-class citizen. We are creating a resource here. So I'll review that and see if we can submit it. Validation passed. Great. Let's submit. And it was done successfully. Julio's already shown up here. And what happened? We invoked a CRUD operation on our function. So over here we can check out motorcycles. Had a couple. Let's add another one. Let's see. Had a, what was there before? Had a Honda GL 1800, and I know that everybody here knows exactly what that is. So I'll review and create this one, submit. And now I can manage this list. So I'm going to get rid of the Buell that I had. That was probably a mistake buying that one. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And that's actually deleting the resource that is being created. Note that I can select one or more of these items. And when I do, here I'm going to deselect. When I do, up here, this button is our custom context action. And we might define an operation on a function that is going to take as a payload information about these resources. So we can select one or more. And we didn't, right? Our example was pretty trite and it doesn't really do much. So it runs a keep alive command basically to ensure that those resources are there. And we can define the text around this. We can put multiple of these commands in place. And again, we can invoke any endpoint operation that we've defined that is accepted as part of the Azure API set. Okay. And trying to think of anything else we can do. I know that we can take a look here. This is an interesting component of this whole thing. Remember that we have IDs that address each resource in Azure. Well, here's this one. Custom providers, resource providers, public, remember we defined that as our endpoint, motorcycles, and then the custom ID of that motorcycle that was generated on the fly. And you can see that this is the resource type. So we've declared a first-class citizen resource type here. And let's back off of this just a little bit. I'm going to jump back into this managed resource group and note the following. This is a very simplistic implementation, right? We're not actually deploying a database, as I mentioned as an example in the beginning of this demo. What we're doing is just storing some information in table storage inside this storage account. So that information that's stored in the table service, this is a new UI, is not accessible to me. Why is that? Somebody tell me why I can't get to this table storage. Besides Scott. Chat works. Permissions, yeah, what permissions? Why? I mean, I created this thing, right? So why can't I get into it? I'm coming at it from the customer side. And yeah, as it notes here, it doesn't have permission to get in there, right? I guess I should have said the careful reader of the small text will get this right. But that's what's going on. But you can trust me when I tell you that if you come in via the right managed identity, identity rather, you will be able to see that all we're doing is holding some records in table storage and pointing at them with those resource identities. That's what's going on there. All right, so with that, I think we're done with custom resource providers. Happy to answer any questions. I see there's some things going on in chat, so let me see if I can catch up here. Let's see. The dev team is trying to encode a complex graph of objects to a JSON-like structure.
Yeah, well, they're saying that, it's a good idea. Use maybe a DLL or upload a DLL instead of you having to describe the object in JSON on the file, right? So
it is a good point. It is a good point. Okay. And so it looks like, Alexander, you've done this yourself, and you can attest to the JSON being somewhat difficult to get through. Hopefully, the lab materials here will assist you in bootstrapping any efforts that you might have.
right.
With that, I think, Julio, will be handing back to you.
Yeah, so